The paper tries to outline a framework that will help our discussions over the next 3 days, and it starts with a puzzle. And the puzzle, as I suggested in my opening remarks, is this mismatch between what the regime, the global refugee regime, was created to do and what it has done. The paper outlines the norms, the foundation of the regime, namely the 1951 Convention, and the institutions, namely UNHCR, with this core mandate of protection and solutions. There's a mismatch, a disconnect between what this regime has been mandated to do and what it has been able to do for the past 60 years, where we see these significant gaps in protection for refugees in the global north and the global south, where we find that 65% of the world's refugees are in protracted refugee situations, having been in exile for 5 or more years, and that despite the growth in the size and the scope and the complexity of the regime, the inclusion of greater number of categories of displaced populations, that we find that there's a significant lack of predictability in the regime's ability to deliver on its core promises of protection and solutions for refugees. So the question that the paper poses is, to what extent can we explain these gaps between the mandate and the history? To what extent does the concept of power help explain these gaps? And it's a potentially significant gap when we consider the way the literature has treated or not dealt with the concept of power. There's a significant literature that I discuss in the paper that deals with the politics of the refugee regime itself, the politics of asylum in various regions. There's a literature that discusses challenges of international protection. But there's little systematic treatment with the concept of power, with some very important exceptions. So, to say that there is a limited treatment of power is not to say that important sources in the literature do not engage with the concept of power. Many of them written by colleagues who are in the room right now. But what we find is that there are different ways the concept of power has been addressed in the literature. That there's a literature that engages with concepts of labels, categorization, discourse, technologies of control. And here I think of works of Roger Zetter and Lippert and Martin Geiger and Jennifer Heinemann and William Walters and others. And then more generally, there's a literature that talks about the power in the context of international relations, of the power of UNHCR to change behavior, and the power of states to change the behavior of UNHCR. But what seems to be lacking when we review how the concept of power has been treated in the literature is a foundation from which we can have conversations between these diverse perspectives. That this lack of a systematic treatment of the concept of power can be explained in various possible ways. First, there's likely a hesitation to deal with the concept of power for reasons that Thucydides outlined in the history of the Peloponnesian War, that when we talk about power, it goes along with the logic that the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept that which they have to accept. And so there's a concern that we see in the literature, certainly from the 1980s onwards, that to focus on power, to speak the forces of power, may lead to the concern that it legitimizes the exercise of power in ways that contravene the principles of the global refugee regime. But then there's also this concern about propounding conspiracy theory. And that was articulated by Chimney in his 1998 piece, where he, in talking about UNHCR's response to power politics in the context of the former Yugoslavia, says, what I'm propounding here is not conspiracy theory. There's a concern that engaging with power within the literature strays from the objective to the editorial. Now, that being said, these concerns about engaging with power should not be an excuse for not making the effort, for not engaging with the concept of power. Luke's, in his very helpful edited volume from 1986, talks about the need to engage with power is motivated either by the desire to study, acquire, maintain, increase, reduce, or destroy it. And so, as I say in the paper, that regardless of our sense of how power should be exercised or should be understood, that it's important to engage with this concept as a way of trying to understand the role that power plays and to understand who has power within the global refugee regime, when they have power, under what circumstances, and what forms this power might take. So why does it matter? And why does it matter especially when we talk about global regimes like the global refugee regime? It matters because there are certain core assumptions that are challenged when we introduce concepts of power. From a realist perspective, from Mersheimer onwards, there's this concept that within a regime, if you have a strong hegemon, the regime will be stable and will fulfill its mandate. Well, as we'll learn with Susan Martin's paper tomorrow about the United States, arguably the hegemon of the global refugee regime, this hegemonic status does not result in predictability within the global refugee regime. From the work of neoliberalists, there's this notion that the presence of a regime can help ensure cooperation and overcome collective action failure. Headlines from Brussels yesterday, today, and likely tomorrow clearly outline the idea that collective action failure is alive and well within the global refugee regime. So what we see is that in looking at the regime through some of these traditional perspectives of realism, of neoliberalism, that we see that neither of these perspectives can fully be supported given the experience of the global refugee regime. And in the paper, I draw on the example of the deliberations in the Executive Committee in 1998. What I have found more compelling is this notion from Keeley's work in the early 1990s that challenges this assumption that regimes are benevolent, voluntary, cooperative, and thus legitimate associations. And it challenges us to think of regimes as places of contestation, where different actors come together with sometimes competing and contradictory interests, and that these actors interact in a way that sometimes results in outcomes that may be contrary to the very objectives of the regime within which they are working. And I find that quite compelling as a starting point in understanding outcomes within the global refugee regime. And so from that, to understand if power is important, how do we start grappling with this concept of power in the context of international cooperation, in the context of global regimes, and in the context of what's called global governance, which has become this ubiquitous area of study of transboundary issues that are beyond the capacity of any one state to resolve, that the notion that various actors come together to form common solutions. And it's curious that the role of power has been largely absent from the study of global governance, despite its prevalence, with a very notable exception of the work of Barnett and Duval in their edited volume from 2005, which I'll discuss quite a bit, where they suggest these four forms of power, which I will relate to the functioning of the global refugee regime. And I found that this framework helps us put into context two overarching sorts of questions that we can explore over the next 3 days. That if there's no single expression of power, if there are these four forms of power, how do different actors employ different forms of power at different times to achieve certain outcomes? And if not all power is exercised or experienced directly, is there a distinction between power and something else that we might call influence? The simple answer to both, as you'll see, is yes. But because we're going to take 3 days to discuss it, let me give us a little bit more detail. There are four forms of power that are outlined by Barnett and Duval in their work, all of which, I believe, are present within the global refugee regime. The first is this notion of compulsory power that involves the direct control of one actor over another and the use of material resources to advance interests in direct opposition of the interests of others. So, in a very classical sense, it's military capabilities and threats of the use of force. But within the global refugee regime, what we see from the work of Gil Loescher from the early 1990s and onwards, and the work of others, is the way that donors use material resources in conditioning their support for UNHCR and encouraging an emphasis on certain areas of activities, and especially through the exercise of earmarking. But the states in the global south also exercise what we might call compulsory power, with the question of access to territory. If the global refugee regime is not physically allowed to operate on the territory of the state, it does not manifest itself in that place. And there's some questions that I raise in the paper of whether the experience of the global refugee regime suggests that we can expand our notion of compulsory power to include other areas of activities and contributions, for example, the use of refugee resettlement, the strategic use of resettlement, which is something Jennifer will be discussing in her paper later on. Then there's the question of institutional power, and this is a classical sense that realists will further, is that powerful states create institutions as a mechanism for exercising power and influence indirectly, so that the states create international institutions to their benefit, and those institutions come to affect the behavior of others. Now, it's not always very predictable, because as we learned from constructivist work and the work of Barnett and Finnemore, that institutions over time become autonomous actors. And this is the core of Gill's paper on UNHCR, and the first 3 decades of UNHCR's existence, how the United States and its allies created UNHCR as an intentionally very weak and powerless organization, reliant on voluntary contributions, acting in a non-political way, under the authority of the UN General Assembly, but how over time UNHCR grew and became autonomous and demonstrated an ability to act autonomously within the regime and ultimately change the behavior of states. The third form of power is structural power, and this is a much more diffuse form of power deriving from these direct and mutual constitutions of the capacities of actors and the determination of social capacities and interests. In a very simple sense, this is a Marxist understanding of division of capabilities within the international system, or Gramscian understandings of the global economy. In the paper, I try and take it beyond this limited understanding and try and draw on the works of Stephen Krasner, Ravenhill, and others to talk about how structural power might explain these deep asymmetries that we see within the global refugee regime. The tensions between states in the global north and the global south, the way that these asymmetries manifest themselves within regions, such as the Asia-Pacific, as we'll see in Susan's paper tomorrow, how it leads to the north-south impasse that we've seen in Alex's work, Protection by Persuasion, but also how it constrains the way host states could potentially respond to a desire to impose the workings of a global refugee regime. As I've found with work on asylum in Africa, that hosting states are very reluctant to engage in activities that would frustrate their relations with the donor community, upon whom they're reliant for much more than assistance for refugee programming. And finally is the notion of productive power, which is very much arguably the most prevalent form of power that we see considered in refugee and forced migration studies. This is the notion of the production of subjects through diffuse social relations, the idea of the production of subjectivities and the relationship between power and knowledge, the use of discourse, of categories, the ability of actors to create and enforce new realities through the use of knowledge, discourse, and claims of legitimacy. And this has been present in the refugee and forced migration studies literature for 25 years. Since Roger Zetter's work in 1991, and arguably before that, the way that the regime uses categories and labels as a way of functioning in a bureaucratic sense. But also in the intervening years, the way that new categories, different actors have been able to create new categories, to create new realities, and through these new categories, demonstrating power. But it's also interesting, Susan's contribution to the special issue on global refugee policy and Thomas Gammeltoft Hansen, looking at how law and norms may actually work in some way to limit some of the more overt efforts of demonstrating power within the regime by states. But against this, we should balance claims by countries like India, and Ranavir's paper that we'll hear tomorrow, of how countries like India have dissenting views on the legitimacy of the 1951 Convention and how this plays itself out within the context of productive power. In my last 7.5 minutes, let me say that while these four notions or these four forms of power are useful in doing two things, in first of all, shedding light and giving analytical clarity to the various forms of power that exist, it also provides a context within which the the theoretical and the scholarly work on power that exists can be brought into closer conversation, which is very important. But there are at least three limitations that I find in the work of Barnett and Duval that are especially important when we consider the functioning of the global refugee regime. The first is that there is this emphasis on the traditional actors of states, international organizations, and NGOs. And this is, Alex, why I'm so delighted with your paper that you'll be presenting on Friday morning in looking at the role of other actors, epistemic communities, diaspora groups, refugee groups themselves, to look at the full range of actors who are involved in this drama that we're trying to understand. Also a point that has been brought home to me in Gil's response to this work, which is very much the way that we need to understand the functioning, the exercise, the possession of power in a very dynamic and historically situated way. The history of the global refugee regime is a history of different actors both gaining and losing power. That once an actor gains power, it does not necessarily retain it. So if we think of the early control of the United States within the global refugee regime, it did not retain that monopoly of power. Likewise, issues in Susan's paper of Australia and the consequences of its moral authority within the regime, its ability to influence the regime as a result of domestic policies. I also posit in the paper a difference between what we might understand as power and influence, and I go into it at some level in the paper, but let me simply say here that power is one form of activity. There's another form of activity that we might call influence, where actors within bureaucracies interact to try and encourage that actor to act in a particular way or use its power in a particular way. But also following Putnam's theory of the two-level games, that different actors in a domestic context compete to define the realm of possible positions that state actor may take internationally. And I can get into that much more in the discussion time. Coming into the home stretch, I make the arguments here of where we can observe power. Alex Betts, in his extremely important book, Protection by Persuasion from 2009, looks at the role of power in very high-profile, situation-specific situations like the Chinese CPA, Sarafka, ICARA, and Convention Plus. What I argue in the paper is that this understanding of the very high-profile exercise of power can usefully be supplemented by an understanding of the exercise of power in the everyday. And here I suggest that the process by which global refugee policy is made and implemented provides such a context where we can observe different actors, their efforts to demonstrate power and to affect particular outcomes. This can be done in a number of ways. Through an understanding that global refugee policy can be understood as a process by which policy is made, implemented, and evaluated. Made at a global level, implemented in particular contexts. In the policy-making process, it raises these questions of how certain issues make it onto the agenda of the global refugee regime. Who's able to present different policy options? Which voices matter in the formalization of a particular policy? And then, as we've learned in the work of Alexander Betts, Phil Orchard, and others, that the implementation process opens up a whole new realm of questions of contestation and influence. And under what factors or conditions do we explain variation in the implementation of a single policy in different local contexts? And I argue that global refugee policy provides a context for understanding and observing power by understanding the factors that explain outcomes of the process, and to understand the factors that explain dynamics at each stage of the process. It helps give clarity to the range of actors who are involved in the process of making and implementing policy, states, international organizations, NGOs, and possible actors. And don't worry, I'm not going into this in detail. But what it does is it provides us a series of stages and the range of actors and a way that we can begin to map at various moments in the process which actors demonstrate particular forms of power, what forms of power they demonstrate, and through process tracing, how effective is that form of power in influencing outcomes. So this is a process that we can take and apply to the process by which different policies are made in the context of XCOM or other policy forums in Geneva. It's a process that we can take and look at the effort to implement particular examples of global refugee policy in different national contexts. Through this process, begin identifying variation and then starting to explain variation. The preliminary conclusions that I offer in the paper is that there are these different actors that exercise what we might call power in very different ways at different stages in the global refugee policy process. That not all actors are able to exercise power in the same way, that it's not static, that there's a difference between influence and power. That there's a need to develop a much more systematic methodology to identify, observe, study, and understand power. And I hope that the next 3 days provide us an opportunity to begin that process. But I do believe that a more systematic study of the global refugee policy process provides a context within which such a methodology can be developed, and provides an opportunity to bring the existing understandings of power in the literature of refugee and forced migration studies. We can bring these different understandings of power into conversation, and then ultimately, my hope is that a more rigorous understanding of power will contribute to an understanding of the functioning of the global refugee regime, and may contribute to the regime's effectiveness and predictability. There are also a number of remaining questions that exist, and these questions relate to the various foundations of power, what role authority and legitimacy plays in the exercise or the possession of power, whether there's a hierarchy of power. If we have compulsory power and productive power encountering each other, being exercised by different actors, which form of power will be dominant? We need to understand the mechanisms of power. What are the day-to-day functionings and practices within the regime that, in which or through which various forms of power are manifest? And how can we differentiate between the conscious and unconscious use of power? When actors use power, do they always do it on purpose? My hope is that over the next 3 days that we will begin to at least see or understand or discuss or deliberate the relevance of these questions in the various case studies that we'll be considering. I also hope that through our deliberations over the next 3 days that we'll understand how in a collaborative way we may begin to give clarity and precision to our understanding of power in the global refugee regime. Thank you.